Greetings of the day, everyone. I'm privileged to welcome you all into the third edition of Orange City Literature Fest organized by SGR Knowledge Foundation in association with GH Raisoni University, powered by Raisoni Group of Institutions. I am Maitre Jambulkar, delegated to be your anchor for today's session. Where do your ideas come from? A writer shares her secrets by Miss Paro Anand. Paro Anand writes for children, young adults, and adults. She won the Sahitya Akademi Bal Sahitya Puruskar in 2017 for her anthology Wild Child, now published as Like Smoke. She has spoken about and written extensively on children's literature in India. She headed the National Center for Children's Literature, the National Book Trust, India, the apex body for children's literature in India. She also runs a podcast on Hubhopper called Literature in Action and was an invitee to the India conference at the Harvard Business School in 2018. She was awarded the Kalinga Karubaki Award for Fearless Writing in 2019. She is well known for her work with children in difficult circumstances, including those impacted by violence in Kashmir, and has written extensively on the subject. It's an honor to have you with us, Ms. Paro Anand. I once again welcome you, ma'am, and would now like to humbly invite you, ma'am, for your address to our audience.
Thank you so much, and thank you to the Orange City Literature Festival. It's great to be a part of something, and the exciting part of what is happening is that we are not thinking outside the box, but we're thinking differently inside the box. Inside the box being our laptop screens and our computer screens, because we're not able to be there, but we are able to maybe travel much more. I've been traveling the world through the pandemic virtually, and you get a very interesting perspective, actually. Certainly for children, it's very, very difficult. But for me, one thing has been very difficult, and that is, where do I get my ideas from? Now, this is a question that's probably the most commonly asked question from authors. मैम आपके ideas कहाँ से आते हैं? Titles कहाँ से आते हैं? And the fact is, for me, I know it sounds a little like cheesy kind of answer, but the fact is that I get my ideas from you, from the children who I work with, and I've worked with over 3 lakh children over the course of many years. Um, and their feedback, your feedback, is what feeds my writing. So, really, 50% of my work is um working with young people, and as was mentioned, especially children in difficult circumstances. And then 50% of my time is spent in writing about those very children. So that is the inspiration, and that's where the idea comes. So, in short, if I had to answer this question in one word, it would be life. Where do your ideas come from? Life. I think that's true for most writers. Even where it's some wild, imaginative story, it's still life that is feeding our writings. And in the pandemic, of course, life became very small, very restricted and tight. And I was stuck. I've never been stuck. I'm often asked, the second most common question perhaps is, um, have you ever faced the writer's block? I hadn't. I never faced the writer's block. But now, pandemic, COVID, I experienced a creative lockdown myself. And it was very difficult because I'm a very consistent writer. I write every day. And suddenly, I didn't have anything to write on. write about. And so I thought, okay, I'll just wait till this thing is over. And then, of course, it became apparent that the pandemic was not going anywhere. And I thought, what to write on, what to write on. At that time, my daughter was working in the Dharavi slums, trying to rehabilitate families who had lost their livelihoods, the migrants who were fleeing. And I started writing a little bit about what she was talking about, what she was experiencing. And then I thought, there are, for the first time, the whole world is tied by one common thread of an enemy. We are tied by this enemy, gagged and bound by this common enemy. And that common enemy, of course, was COVID, pandemic, and it was locking us all. And so I wrote Unmasked. This is my newest book. Unmasked is the so you see it's a very interesting and very evocative cover. This part is the Dharavi slums. This part are the multi-storied flats which are literally fed by people coming from Dharavi who come into these flats. And this is a common enemy of COVID. So you see, it's a really, really effective cover because it encapsulates everything. So I thought, I just started writing without thinking, is it going to be a novel? Is it going to be short stories? Is it going to be for little kids? Is it going to be for older people? Is it for adults? Is it for young adults? Young adults is like my favorite target audience. That's what I love to write. And when I started writing, I found said, how am I going to peg all these stories together? Is it going to be a novel about one set of characters? But the pandemic was so much wider. And so I thought, I'm going to write COVID's 19 stories. COVID's 19 stories. So there were going to be 19 short stories through it all. I'm still not getting the hang of it. I often start my books with some lyrics of a song or a poem that I've read or a quote from a book and something which sort of sets a frame. And I didn't have a frame for this. I didn't know what to do. During those days, I was conducting a workshop with young people and some older people. And one young girl wrote a beautiful poem called What Would You Do? And that became my binding thread. That is what the peg on which I could hang all these stories. So it asks the slum dwellers, pandemic has happened. What will you do? Will you flee? Will you run away? Will you pack up your belongings and go? If you are a child who lives in a multi-story building, what will you do? Can you do anything? Of course, there's the pandemic. You're not allowed to go out. So what will you do if you are living here? What are you going to do? Is there anything that you can do? That became the binding. What can you do? And that often is the question that I ask myself in my writing. What can I do? What will you do? And so I wrote COVID's 19 stories and the marketing people, because I was writing it in 2020, and the book was only going to come out in 2021. And the marketing people said, by the time the book comes out, COVID will be over, pandemic will be over, and people will not want to read about it anymore. So it's a good idea for a collection, but don't call it COVID-19. And the editor came up with this beautiful title, Unmasked. And of course, COVID has not gone anywhere. It's still very much here. We're still very much living in fear of this common enemy. So that's where these stories came from. And each of them, whether it is a woman who, or a little boy who runs away from his home in Dharavi, from his chawl, and goes and finds a empty koli, someone who has abandoned the koli, probably one of the migrants who left. The boy runs away because he has a drunken father, a drug addict father, who makes life miserable, normal circumstances, but now it's worse because he's not getting his drink and he's not getting his drugs. So he's in a very bad temper. So the child runs away and he discovers something very strange in the mattress of this koli. And of course, I'm not going to give away the whole story, but what is it that is discovered? What do they do about it? And you're going to have to read the stories to find out what. But one thing I will share. Since it's a common thread, the first chapter, of course, is the poem by this girl who I talked about, 12-year-old girl. She opens the book. And then I've written 17 stories. And the 19th story is your story. Oh. Your COVID story. What is your experience? So that each copy of this book will be unique. Because each of us has a COVID story. For the first time, you can be a part of a published book, right? So that's where that story came from. This is another book of mine, No Guns at My Son's Funeral, a book that was the first of its kind in the country. No Guns at My Son's Funeral is a very tough title. This story came to me in Kashmir. I was working with the government at that time, and we were working on a project which was the world's longest newspaper. We were getting children, going around the country, getting children in difficult circumstances to write their own stories. And so what we would do is that in every place we would give 50 meters or so of kapda and get them to write their own stories. And I hope the noise is not too much. Is it a little noisy? Shall I ask somebody to cut the noise? It's all right? Okay. So I was working in the government and getting children to, I'm so sorry, I hope you'll be able to edit this bit out. So I was working in the government, and we were working on the project of the world's longest newspaper, traveled all over the country. Over 3,000 children participated. It is the world's longest newspaper, 825 meters long. written in 13 Indian languages, including English, and across 11 states. So I was in Kashmir working with children in Kashmir, and news that Kargil में से घुसपैठ आ रहे हैं, there is infiltration, some terrorists have come in, and I was right on the border. I was in Baramulla, and we were to go to Uri, and news, this sort of unsettling news was coming. The children were also staying there. I was also staying there. And then one early morning, the sound of bomber jets, of planes flying, uh, was very disturbing. Woke up with a start, and the Kargil conflict had started up. The children couldn't leave, and we couldn't leave because the situation was tense. Airport was closed, roads were closed. And in that, one child, one young girl who was about 15 years old, I think she was, she said this: whatever else happens, let there be peace. And I thought this is really powerful because children are not necessarily involved in the politics of the world, but they are involved in their lives, they're concerned for their futures. And in a circumstance of conflict like these children were growing up in, their future was very murky and dark. And all this girl wanted was peace. She didn't care. Let this happen, let that happen, let the politics play out. But let us have peace. And it was such a powerful collection of words for me. Later on, I went to Srinagar. And I was in my hotel just looking out onto the road. And I saw a group of boys. One of them was being picked on by the others. They were bullying this boy. They were young men, really. They were bullying this one boy, laughing at him. After a little while, they all were walking away. And they left this boy behind. He had a little limp, but he stayed back. And my eye went to just down the road where there was a man leaning on a wall, and he had been watching this whole thing. As this boy with the limp was left alone, this man who had been leaning on a wall straightened up and went straight to this boy. They talked for a few minutes, and after a little while, the boy who was being bullied turned around and went with this man. He was a young boy being recruited as a militant. They look for the most vulnerable. This boy was vulnerable. He was young. He was isolated. And maybe this recruiting militant had told him, do you want to handle a gun? Do you want to learn how to do it? And this child, young man, so bullied, so isolated, may have said yes. And he went. And it's that quick. And I'm against the window pane wanting to shout out, stop, 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 don't go with him. There has to be something better. But he went. And from that, gave no guns at my son's funeral. And I'm just going to read to you a little bit from this. It's way into the book, chapter 20, actually. And the situation is that there's a young boy, Aftab, who is the main protagonist of the story. Aftab is about 12 years old. He is almost blindly in love with Akram, who is the leader of a militant outfit. And Akram has gone into hiding and he has called Aftab to come and meet him in the woods in the night. Break curfew and come and meet me for further instruction. And this little boy goes. Part of the story that I'm going to read to you is in flashback, but I'll get to that. Under cover of the dark, dark night, Aftab steals away. He is proud of himself at this moment, for this is the moment that he has lived for these past years since he joined Akram Bhai. The night, the darkness leaps up at him as he enters the forest. His courage sways a little. He dreads the solitude. He is afraid of the dark. He takes a deep breath and starts to hum a tune. And then shuts himself up quickly. How stupid can he be? He must be soundless, like Akram has always taught him to be. He tries to think of this or that, but nothing can distract him from the dark that fills the space around him and presses into his eyes as if to blind him. The sharp smell of pine, the grating of cicadas. Shh. High wind, hush in the trees, whispering secrets, cracking twigs, all add up to the feeling alone, alone. Akram Bhai. Now there's a thought that he can focus on. As Aftab clambers forward, his mind meanders back to the beginning when he first met his Akram Bhai, and he looks back and he starts to remember. It was a beautiful sun-ripened morning, but Aftab was on his own. He hadn't done his homework, so he had skipped school. Of course, his father, a school teacher in the same school, would get to know. He would feel the lash of his father's tongue and maybe the stick. That was later. For now, Aftab was completely happy, diving into the gentle Jhelum River, swimming out into its soft center, and lying in wait. And then he had it, clutched firmly in his hand, held aloft. The silver fish thrashed, but Aftab's fingers did not let go. And that's when he saw the man sitting on the bank, watching. The man smiled and waved, and Aftab waved back. That's very impressive, the man said, looking at the fish as Aftab waded into the shadows. Can you do it again? There was the faintest hint of challenge in the man's voice. Aftab handed the fish over to the stranger and dived back into his spot. And then he waited, making himself a block of wood in his stillness. Then, quicker than the eye could follow, the man saw the boy disappear under the shimmering water and come up with a whoop of delight, another fish flailing in his triumphant hands. The stranger asked him how he did it. And feeling the flush of recent victory, feeling so important, gave the handsome stranger a step by step lesson on patience, watchfulness, stillness, and speed. By the end of the lecture, Akram's eyes were ablaze. He asked the boy about himself, and the child, enjoying the company of this handsome man, flattered by the attention he rarely got, told him all about his life, his family, his likes, his dislikes, and also that he was often bored. Akram needed to hear just that. He had caught his fish too. Slogans at my son's funeral. Quick as that, a little child bunking school becomes a militant. He doesn't know what he's in for. He doesn't know what end awaits him. That's how it happens. And that is where, looking out of my hotel window and seeing that boy and this girl who said, "Let there be peace," while a war is swirling around her, steaming around her, she wants peace. And those are the two things that gave me inspiration for this book. While researching this book, I found something else, that there is something horrible that was done. I'm not sure if it's still happening. The families of disappeared men in Kashmir, the women were called half widow, and the children of a disappeared man, because you disappeared because you don't know, has he been killed by militants or has he become a militant? So the children are called half orphans, half orphan and half widow. And when I heard these two words, it ignited a fire in me and saying, what a horrible thing to be identified as half a person. You have half an identity. You are identified by what is missing in your life. And I wrote a follow-up work called Weed. Weed is about the family of a disappeared man, a young boy who is so tempted because life is so hard, join militancy because that's where the money is. It seems to be easier. And a mother who is adamant that he will not. So these two books sort of go hand in hand. And those are the inspiration. When I was reading these two books out to audiences, I think it was in Bangalore, but I'm not very sure. A girl said to me, she said, "Ma'am, you've written about two boys in Kashmir, and you've written about the Muslim children. You've not cared to write about the Kashmiri Pandit story of how the Hindus, the Kashmiri Pandits, were driven out of Kashmir. That exodus, that migration, and that we became refugees. What she said is we became refugees in our own country." That struck me. And I knew that I wanted to write a story of something about the Kashmiri Pandit story from and have a girl protagonist. When I started to write the Kashmiri Pandit story, and I felt, the story of forced migration, of being driven out, is so common throughout the world. Think about it. Those the Syrian refugees, the Rohingya refugees, all over, the tribals who are forced out of being who they are, the native Indians in America, in North America, who were driven out of their homes, the Tibetans who were driven out by China. It's a universal story of forced migration. So I wanted to write two parallel stories and show the commonality while being diverse stories. So again, that thread which binds, a common tragedy which binds us. So I thought I would write about a Tibetan girl and a Kashmiri Pandit girl, but the Tibetan story, I actually had in mind a particular ceremony called the Breathtaking Ceremony. And that particular ceremony came out of when I was sitting by my mother, who was ill and dying and slipping away. And she had told my sister and me, let me go. Don't put me on ventilators and life support and all, let me go. And we were doing that. But her body struggled for breath. Breath was difficult for her to draw, and yet it breathed. Her body breathed. And the thought came to me, maybe she hasn't finished all her breaths. She still has SARS in her. Maybe everybody is born with a certain number of breaths. And until you finish, you cannot slip away. And I thought, I wish there was a way in which I could wrap up those breaths and be able to release her. So it was a painful time. And so for the parallel story with the Kashmiri Pandit story, I made up a tribe, and this resulted in this book, Nomad's Land, about Kashmiri Pandit's girl, whose name is Shana, and a tribe which I made up. I call them the Kushavans. It draws from the Rohingya experience, the Tibetan experience, and all of that. But in fact, it's a made up tribe, the Kushavans, who lived on the high plateaus, and they were driven out. And they had a beautiful ceremony called the Breathtaking Ceremony, where somebody, practitioner, through your son, because I made up the language, I made up the customs. So through your son draws and wraps the breaths into a yak tail stick. And so I'm going to read to you a little bit of the breathtaking ceremony. They gathered all the things that were going to be needed. And by the way, it is the Kashmiri Pandit girl, because it cannot be a relative. So the Kashmiri Pandit girl performs this breathtaking ceremony, which has been outlawed by governments who don't understand. The ceremony itself was not a difficult one. As Devek Dan had said, it was peaceful, gentle, a simple winding of breaths around the yak-tail wisp that had been blessed. As each breath of a dying person was wrapped, they came one step closer to their last one. Time seemed to slow down. as though time was telling her that the moment had arrived. Shana kneels on a cushion on the ground. She gently taps the yak-tail wisp just above Mola's chest. Mola is Pema, the other girl, her grandmother, just above Mola's chest, and repeats the words that must be said for every breath. Sans ko mayu, leaf. Sans ko mayu, leaf. Mola exhales a breath as long and as deep as she can manage. As the rooster feathers flutter, Shana gives the tail, the yak tail, a flick and turn. It seems so simple. Sans ko mayu leaf. Tap, turn. Sans ko mayu leaf. Tap, turn. The rhythm of the words hypnotizes her. Although the room is empty, Shana feels the room start to fill up. Others have entered. And as they do, Mola's breath flows easier, softer. Shana is gently rocking to the music of the words. Sans ko mayu leaf, tap, wine. Sans ko mayu leaf, tap, wine. A weight lifts from the grandmother's face. Her lips turn into a slight smile. Her eyes flicker open. There is a light in them. The milkiness has gone. Her gaze rests on Shana, the love sweeping over the girl. I'm ready, she whispers. I'm almost there to your son. Shana nods, understanding, and resumes her chant. Sans ko mayu, leaf, tap, wine. Thank you are the last words that come from Mola. Shana looks up at last. She was surprised to see Pema and her mother leaning on either side of the bed. Where's everyone gone? She asked. But no one had been there, just Shana. When the end came, mother and daughter had come back in. Odd, Shana whispers. So many people came, Pema. They came to take her. Pema looked up at her friend and was about to say that no one had come. But then she realized that it wasn't people who came for her precious Mola. Not exactly people. A shiver went down her spine. The room felt strange, but not in a frightening way. Shana wept then. Tears for a woman she had not known, but now would never forget. She was now bound to her. The three wept silently for a while before Pema's father came in and put his hand on Shana's shoulder. He helped her get up and held her steady as her legs had gone numb from kneeling for so long. Then Pema's father did a strange thing. He bent low, touching her feet. Shana almost recoiled in surprise. No, no, don't do that. No, the father says, looking up. You are a true through your son, a rare breathtaker. You are sacred to us now. And that is the story of Nomad's Land. So you see how stories are inspired one from the other, from the other, from the other. They sort of telescope. And it's strange because I often write my stories, my books, two at a time. And sometimes I have to write a story. Here's Being Gandhi, which I was asked to write by the editor. She said, please do a book on Gandhi for 150 years. And my first answer was, no, I can't. I can't. What more is there to say about Gandhi for young? And she said, we want you to write a book for children, such as one that has not been written before. That's when I realized that I had this lump, this wound in my throat, which had been there a long time. And as I started to write, the story came. So Being Gandhi is not written about Gandhi, the man. It's not written about the freedom movement. In fact, it's placed in 1984, the assassination of Indira Gandhi and the subsequent riots that happened. And a child who didn't care less about anything wonders when those riots happen, and the riots break out and happen right across the corridor from, and his neighbors are killed. Does he think, can I be Gandhi? And so much of my writing, this is the one which won the Sahitya Akademi Award. This is a book called The Other, which is about how we otherize people, how we almost fear and reject people who are different from us. So these are a few of my books that I wanted to bring to you and just share with you where do ideas come from? They come from life. They come from living. As a writer, I always have my antenna up. I eavesdrop into conversations. And sometimes the idea immediately starts to flow. Sometimes it doesn't, and I file away an idea. I have a file on my laptop called What an Idea Surgery, and I'll go back to it. What I do is to write consistently every single day to keep the creative juices flowing. And I sometimes end up writing two books at a time. So from 2020 to 2021, I've actually published 5 books, 3 for younger children and 1 collection of short stories, which is Unmasked and Nomad's Land. Thank you so much for having me here. I think I'm out of time now, but I've really enjoyed the opportunity to be able to share with you my writings and where they come from. Thank you to the Orange City Literature Festival for giving me this platform. Thank you.
The stories you told were really amazing and heart-touching, ma'am. At the outset, I would like to thank Paro Anand, ma'am, for joining us today. We wish we get to hear you again and be equally enlightened as we all are today. And for my dear amazing audience, I'm sure that after witnessing this conversation, you all are taking home an enriched version of yourself, just as I will. Thank you for joining us today. Until I see you again, this is Vetra Jambulkar signing off.
And please do read the books.
Vision Beyond.